Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Malamud. We start precisely at 4 o'clock. Bangalore International Center does that, and if we don't start at 4, they kick us out. So there may be people wandering in over time. I know with traffic, it's sometimes tough to get here. So I'm Carl Malamud. I run Public Resource. I am joined by Lawrence Liang. Lawrence is the Dean of the Ambedkar School of Law, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Omprakash manages a huge scanning operation, and you're going to hear more about that as we go along. A noted Wikipedian and Mozillian and open source guy. Also has done amazing work putting resources in the Kannada language online. So we're going to today tell you a little bit about what we're doing here, about where we want to bring things, and what people can do to help us. I've been working in India for a long time, but this whole effort of servants of knowledge, of scanning things and putting them online, started in maybe 2018 or 2017. And for a while there, I was buying every government book I could find, and books that are out of copyright, things like the Asian Educational Services series, the reprints of old books, and shipping them back to the US. And scanning them and putting them online. In 2019, we managed to ship a scanner over and install it at the Indian Academy of Sciences. We scanned all the Indian Academy of Sciences work. We got 2 more scanners through customs, although they did sit in storage for a year. And we had to pay a considerable sum of money in storage charges in order to get them back out of customs. We actually make our own scanners now in India. And these are sophisticated devices. You might have seen the publicity for this event. They are tabletop scribes. There's a large frame with LED lights in it. There's 2 high-end cameras, and there's a cradle for the book. And you hit a pedal, and the cradle goes up to the glass. It takes pictures. You take your foot up, the cradle goes down, you flip the page. And if you get good at these devices, you can scan 500 pages in an hour on a sustained basis once you learn how to use these. These are sophisticated devices. Your scans are high resolution. They go into a computer. They get assembled. We double check them. Did we get every page? We say where page 1 is, right? So if there's front matter, page I, page II, page 1. We label that. And that means that later on, when you want to go to page 1, you can do that. Or you want to go to page 15, you can do that. And so we do that, and then there's something called the publication process. And in the publication process, we de-skew the pages, right? We make sure that they're straight. We de-warp them because the pages may curve a little bit. We check for image quality. It gets run through optical character recognition. And when we first began this, the Internet Archive, which is a nonprofit organization we work with, and we push our materials there, they didn't do Indian languages. And so what we would do is we take the scans and we bring them down, we'd throw them over to Google, we do the OCR, and then we shove them back into the Internet Archive. Now, since then, they have figured out how to do OCR in pretty much every language, so we don't do OCR anymore. There's a whole set of other processes of derivation. So you have JPEG 2 files, very high resolution. Those get assembled into a PDF file, right? They get turned into an ebook. They get put online with the metadata. And then we go through and we try to fix the metadata. So we've done that for the Indian Academy of Sciences. We had a scanner over at the World Konkani Center and have done 1,000 books in Konkani, one of the larger collections. We had a scanner at the Roja Muthaya Memorial Library in Chennai and scanned those. And then COVID hit. And with COVID, it was really hard to keep people employed. Buildings were shutting down. And so we consolidated our operations back in Bangalore and approached the National Law School of India University and said, you know what? We'll scan your library. And so now that we're building our own scanners, we have 9 scanners over at the National Law School of India University. We've scanned roughly 25,000 books. We're scanning 12.5 lakh pages every month. and we are in the process of doubling our capacity. We just opened a second scan center at the B.M. Sri Library, and we are in the process of getting that up to speed and beginning to scan those materials. We work a lot with born digital materials as well. And so, for example, the Public Library of India is what I call it on the Internet Archive. We've got 7.5 lakh pages, books there. And we have like 50,000 books in Sanskrit. We have books in Gujarati. We have 100 different languages there, a very significant number. Many of those are mirrors of digital archives that were out there. The West Bengal Public Library, for example. We have that collection, the Archaeological Survey of India, the Tamil Virtual Academy. But we have other collections that are very carefully curated. And my baby is the Hind Swaraj collection. And I've been working on that for quite a while. We have the complete collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, the complete works of Ambedkar, the entire run of the selected works of Nehru, works of Radhakrishnan, speeches of presidents, speeches of prime ministers, lots of other very interesting books. Other collections, there's 20,000 movies and audio in the Indian culture collection. A whole bunch of others. Jay Gyan is the top level collection, Victory to Knowledge. And if you go there, you'll see 40 sub-collections that are available. So there's things people can do to help us out. Our Telugu books, for example, from the government had something called the Digital Library of India, which is since defunct, and I made a copy before it went down. The people that did that, they would take all the Telugu titles and they transcribe them into Roman script. And there's a standard for doing that, but they didn't use the standard. They just made it up as they went along. And so we had a volunteer, Arjuna, went through by hand and recast every one of the titles into Telugu script. We have other people going through all the Tamil titles and correcting the titles. And so they'll leave a review and they say the correct title is this. The correct author is this. Other people are going through the Sanskrit collections and adding finding aids, right? Different words for accessing these materials. In fact, Arjuna is here, did a whole bunch of work on the Telugu collection. Other people are uploading books, and they'll write to me and say, I've uploaded, 1,000 books to the community collection, but it's really a coherent whole. And we'll make a collection for them and move them all in there, and then add them to the top level collection. So you can upload your books. We have other people going and they have books they have copyright permission for, right? They go to the publishers or they are the rights holders and they'll upload them. We have other people that are interested in palm leaves, right? Or have materials that are available. What we can't do right now is, you have 1,000 books you want scanned and, you can't just drop them off and we'll scan them for you. But if you have an interesting collection, you can go to Om and, we might be able to scan a half dozen of them. And in the future, what we're hoping is to expand our operation, right? So now we're 9 scanners at the law school, 3 scanners at BM Sri or 4? 5, okay. So, and we're continuing to build more scanners. So those are professionals that operate those. They're people we pay, and we try to make sure the quality is consistent. We're hoping in the future maybe there's going to be, community scanning centers and things like that as we expand our operation. So the purpose of this session was kind of introduce what we're doing and tell you what's going on, let you know what's going on. So if you go outside when you're done, there's a bunch of QR codes. Just take a picture of those, and that'll send you to the proper URIs on the Internet Archive. Or you just go to the Internet Archive and search. Right? Hind Swaraj is the name of my collection. Servants of Knowledge is the one that Om has been maintaining. Jay Gyan is the top level. You'll see a bunch of other stuff as well, but you can pretty quickly, if you see a collection that's got 1 million items in it, in the right place. Or you can just go to Google. That's another way to do it, right? jgyansitearchive.org. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. And then when we're done, I'm hoping there's a lot of questions. We have an audience mic here, so we're taping this. Audience mic is right here at the front. So after these guys are done speaking, we're hoping that you have questions, comments, and other things you can contribute. So Lawrence Liang, we're going to let him take over from here.
How do I turn this mic on?
Oh, it's just
all right. Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to do two things. I'm going to speak about the law, because one of the crucial questions that arises with any project of this kind is, what allows you to do it, and what's the relationship between copyright and what you want to do. But, come on, it's a bit early in the evening to be talking about the law. So what I want to do instead is to try to give you a perspective, looking at this idea, what the concept of the servant of knowledge might mean to thinking about copyright. How can we think about copyright from the perspective of the servants of knowledge? And that's important for a number of reasons. Whenever you talk about copyright law, you tend to think about it in terms of ownership. So it's in that sense, the master's perspective on property. And I'm curious to think about what one could make as an argument between an idea of an overt concept of copyright law and covert concept of copyright law. What do I mean by this? Let's take the idea of the servant of knowledge. Copyright, philosophically, is in many ways grounded in the thoughts of John Locke. And the Lockean theory of labor was the argument that if somebody exerts their labor, intellectual labor in this case, they're entitled to the fruits of their labor. It's an argument that was grounded in a way in the coming together of the language of property and personhood and the birth in a way of liberalism. What we rarely get to know when we think about John Locke outside of as an abstract philosopher is the concrete material realities of Locke's life. Locke, amongst other things, was actually one of the worst bosses that you could ever have. Amongst the various things that Locke was responsible for was a large number of penal legislations that actually, resulting eventually in the death penalty for crimes against property. So he was the architect of various laws that basically advocated greater kind of punishments. And if you look at the people who were actually, sentenced to death in the 18th century, a large number of them were actually servants, right? So there's a brilliant book by Peter Lineborg called The London Hanged. And it begins with this incredible line which says, "There is no more curious word than the word capital in criminology and in economics. Because in the one, it represents life, like, capital investment, etc. And in the other, it represents death, capital punishment." And his book is basically about the coming together of the two. And one of the characters who's very crucial in Peter Lineborg's account is John Locke. So amongst various things, Peter Lineborg very laboriously describes the completely problematic relationship that Locke had to actual kind of, to his actual servants, and the number of cases or large number of people who were hanged in that period were hanged for stealing, for example, 2 silver spoons, a silk napkin, etc. So what does this allow us to do? If Locke in some ways stands for the conscious memory of the philosophy of copyright, what would it mean to think not so much from the master's perspective, but to think from the servant's perspective? And here I want to actually offer a couple of empirical accounts of heroes or servants of knowledge who you will never find narrated in, let's say, at least copyright books. An English teacher who taught at St. Joseph's, many of us benefited from studying with him, etc., was a big fan of Saul Bellow, huge fan of Saul Bellow. And he thought that he had all the Saul Bellow novels that were around. And this is, of course, pre-internet days. Till on a trip to Madras, he discovers a Saul Bellow novel that he didn't have. Unfortunately for him, the library didn't allow him either to borrow the book or to photocopy the book. So what does the teacher do? He sits in the library over the next 10 days and copies the entire novel by hand. Brings his entire notes to Bangalore, types out the entire novel, and then photocopies and cyclostyles and photocopies and gives it to his students. So if Walter Benjamin spoke about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, this is the work of love in the age of mechanical reproduction. The idea that practices and acts of transmission can be a way in which a certain kind of affective excess is put back into an object of knowledge so that it acquires a density of value rather than a depletion of value. Because the general story narrated in the history of copyright law is always about the copy being a taking away from. It's the copy depleting the value, especially economic value, of the original, which is kind of ironical and curious because if one were to actually look at the history, the etymological history of the word copy itself, it comes from copia, which is the same root for the copious and the same for copulation. It's about reproduction, a form of reproduction which multiplies the value of rather than takes away the value of a particular object. And to my mind, the history of copyright seen from the perspective of servants of knowledge is really, in a way, an accounting of various forms of the addition of value through the act of copying, through the act of reproduction, through the act of in our case, of course, scanning, etc. Why does this become a way of thinking about a different account of copyright law itself? If one imagined, law having a conscious memory, conscious in terms of its, reproduction in statutes, in legal judgments, etc., there is equally an argument that can be made of the unconscious memory of the law, right? So George Simmel, for example, says that gratitude is the moral memory of mankind. When that moral memory is legislated, it becomes contract law, right? What is a contract if not, the ultimate idea of being bound by your words or being bound by a promise? So there is, in a way, a strong moral memory that resides underneath what is a seemingly drab, boring legislation. And to my mind, it's important to actually excavate the moral memory of what copyright law might be about. And it's that which then takes us to a small part of the legal. I'll just give you an overview so that we can talk about it in the discussion. So what is the moral memory of copyright itself? Well, for one, copyright begins as a system of balance that is meant for the promotion of education. So the very first copyright legislation is a legislation called the Statute of Anne of 1706, which describes itself in its title as an act that is meant for the promotion of education. Right? So contrary to the popular belief that very many people have that copyright is supposed to be about the protection of the rights of authors or protection of property or of intangibles, etc., there is a deep, deep-rooted idea of copyright being about the promotion of a particular conception of the public good. So how did this kind of, turn away or happen where now we only associate copyright with, in a way, large industry, the protection of narrow interests, etc. And then what does it mean to recover the moral memory? We're making an argument that fair use and fair dealing exceptions within copyright law is one of the sites where one can locate, in a way, this kind of contested moral memory of copyright. And in India, in particular, it has a particular function to play. If one looks at, for example, the debates that took place in 1956 during the introduction of the Indian Copyright Act and if we go to the parliamentary debates, it's incredible because much before a constitutional recognition of the right to read was read into Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, that happened only in 1985. In 1956, the parliamentarians discussing copyright law were articulating it in terms of the language of the rights of the reader. And their question really was, how do you actually have a system in which there is a recognition that this is not merely about the rights of authors or about the rights of publishers in general, but primarily foregrounding the rights of the reader. It's a history that's been rarely discussed, rarely been brought into discussions on copyright itself. And the other part of it is to actually think about this word, law. You always think about the idea of the law of copyright encompassing a whole range of things, including, for example, what are libraries entitled to doing. But much before copyright talked about libraries, in India you have, the laws of the library sciences. Anyone who comes from the world of library sciences knows that S. Ranganathan formulated these 5 incredible laws of the library, which is every book has its reader. What are the others? It should be at the convenience of the reader. A library is a growing organism, etc. So one way of thinking about the idea of the unconscious of copyright law is to say that what are the normative sources that one should turn to in interpreting what the scope of Section 52, the fair use exception, in Indian law ought to be. We are contending that, one, you locate it within constitutional principles of the right to read. 2, you call upon ideas of the laws of the library as not merely metaphorical laws, but actual concrete ways in which you interpret how a library ought to be designed, as well as what a design in terms of a regulatory design of a library ought to be. So in the Indian context, if you look at the exceptions, they're rather remarkable. They're remarkable for a number of reasons, because the Indian history of fair use is an explicit rejection of the universal story of copyright. The universal story of copyright culminates in 1984 with the TRIPS agreement and the establishment of a common minimum standard of intellectual property across all countries. Well acknowledged that the TRIPS agreement was primarily an agreement drafted by 30 lawyers representing Hollywood and the largest pharmaceutical industries, most developing countries did not have much of a say in the actual content of these laws. The only space then you had was some wriggle room by way of exceptions and limitations that were allowed. And that's really where the Indian Copyright Act in a way shines. The range of exceptions that have been made in copyright law in India for a wide range of uses, and we are only highlighting 4 or 5 of them. The right to research as a personal use exception, the right to education as an educational exception, the disability exception that was very importantly introduced in the 2012 amendment, the library exception, and the exception which is basically about criticism and review, etc. If one were to take only a handful of these, and there are many more in Section 52, how are they to be interpreted? In the Delhi University photocopy case, and for those who don't know, basically the largest publishers in the world brought a case against a small photocopying shop located in Delhi School of Economics called Rameshwari Photocopy Service. And they alleged that the provision of photocopies by way of course packs were illegal because they commercially harmed the publishers, and that there was a quantitative restriction that had to be set on the number of copies that could be provided, and most importantly, you had to have a very narrow understanding of education. So according to the publishers, a teacher could make a copy of an extract of a reading, give it to the student in class, and then take the reading back. That was their understanding of what an educational exception was. So in the Delhi photocopy case, there were 2 judgments that were delivered, one by a single judge bench by Justice N. Law and one by a division bench. Many things in the judgment, I don't want to get into it, but one small thing that I want to leave you with. Justice N. Law says that copyright law is not a natural right. Copyright is not a natural right. Copyright is a statutory right. If it's a statutory right, it has to be circumscribed by the laws of a country, both in terms of the Copyright Act as well as the Constitution, but more importantly by the needs of that country in terms of what is articulated in the exceptions that have been made. He goes on to say that, if the law allows you to do something, in this case, a very crucial thing, you buy a copy of a book, you're a library, why are you allowed to lend a copy of that book? Right? There are reasons why you're allowed to lend it without any restrictions that can be placed on you. This is very different from the entire world of electronic databases and electronic books, where you're not really selling a book to someone. You're only selling them a license or a subscription to use a digital version. So one interesting question that arises, of course, is that if I were to be able to digitize a book, would I be able to lend a digital copy of the same book in the way that I was allowed to do with a physical book? Now, in the case of N. Law's judgment, something very interesting happens. He locates the entire interpretation of copyright law in his own experiences. As a law student, when I was in Delhi University, I would go to the library and I would actually, like the English teacher from St. Joseph's, copy down paragraphs and copy down passages. And he says, if I have a mobile phone that allows me to take a picture of it, does it alter the fact that I'm, again, actually reproducing it for a particular reason? And that reason is education. It's research. If I were to be able to photocopy the entire, let's say a chapter of the book or the entire book, would it make a difference if the reason remained the same? And the question that we are asking, I suppose, and opening out is, if you were able to digitize a book and the reason for it remains the same, namely education, research, etc., would it make a difference that it were in a digital and not merely in a physical format? There are a range of very interesting kind of questions that arise, and I don't think that these are merely legal questions. Of course, they take a legal form, and it's important to engage with it in that sense. But let's take, for example, under the Copyright Act, there's a very important exception given to libraries to make a digital copy of any lawfully acquired book that you have. So let's say you have 100 books in let's say, the BIC library. You are by law allowed to make a digital copy as a backup for purposes of preservation and storage. But what happens if this library were unfortunately to burn down? Would you be allowed to reprint or to print copies of from your digital version? Or would you just be, happy to have your digital version in your computer? So one way of understanding this is to ask really, what is the purpose behind these exceptions? What does the purpose of interpretation of these provisions actually mean? And again, Justice End Law actually allows us that through the Delhi University photocopy case, saying that it doesn't matter in terms of quantity. It doesn't matter whether there is an intermediary. It doesn't matter if there is incidental commercial use. The only real question that remains is, what is the purpose of that act? In that sense, the Servants of Knowledge project is an attempt at highlighting that the idea behind a lot of the activities undertaken under the project is really for the promotion of democratic ideals enshrined within the Constitution, common decency principles of what should be accessible to people on an equitable basis. And we are arguing that that is really in some ways the purpose of many of these projects. One of the great lines that Carl has come up with, being a Gandhian, is scanning is the new spinning. And so I think that this is a way of asking then, if scanning is the new spinning, in what are the ways in which we should think of copyright both as bondage and as freedom? I'll stop here for now. I'm sure there'll be many more things that we can talk about in the Q&A. Yeah. So I hand it over to Om, who's really the beating heart behind this project and responsible for all of the logistical stuff that's happening.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Lawrence. Hi, everyone. So I've been associated with Servants of Knowledge for almost 5 years now, and I was introduced to Carl, I think in 2018 by Arjun Rao Chawla, talking about how he has been making knowledge accessible to public. So during that time, we were in search of references for writing a lot of Kannada Wikipedia pages. We never used to find anything that we can actually quote for our articles, right? And during the same time, we were trying to build language technology for our language to see how we can go back in time and see what was written in our books, what was written in our manuscripts, how we can actually get to know how our language words were born, right? So what is the root word for the word, and which all literatures are really making a social difference, and so many other things. Majorly, I was actually interested in Vachana Sahitya, which was written in 10th, 11th, and 12th century by common people like you and me, right? And even today, we tend to actually access Vachanas to learn a lot from that. In day-to-day life, it makes a lot of difference to us. And we were able to digitize them and make it accessible to public by using a lot of technology, coding, development, and stuff like that. But we didn't have OCR and other advanced technology like what we have today. But when I met Carl, I found that, okay, Digital Library of India was there, it was not accessible. We had that issue. We had the corpus of Digital Library of India, Kannada collection, and people were not able to easily access the metadata of that for various reasons. And then we thought of doing crowdsourcing of the metadata. So in couple of weeks, we were able to get almost 6,500 books indexed properly in Kannada. Then when I met Carl, I found that he has already done so much with Indian literature, and it is already made available for public through Internet Archive. Then we started interacting, we started explaining what we actually want to do with literature related to local languages. Then we found that the Indian Academy of Sciences had a scanner which was not used, and we ended up collaborating as a community to see how we can actually make use of the technology that was already there. Then later we found that just being a community does not work. We have to keep that machine running. So scanning is the new spinning, but who will keep spinning it, right? So we wanted to ensure that the books are not troubled, not destroyed, and we wanted to take that book back to the shelf in the same condition. So Internet Archive gave us the very right tool, technology, and Carl's guidance helped us rethink what we wanted to do with archival. So that's how we started. I took the books that I had from my collection, my own collection. So the second-hand books that we found from 90s, 1950s, 40s, 60s. And then we found that, okay, we don't have any problems with these. We don't have another copy of these books. Then we started talking to people. Why don't you open up your cupboards and see what books you actually want to preserve? There are books that are being destroyed. There are books that we have never heard of. And majorly the science and technology or maths related content. So that is what we were interested in. So when we started talking about it, people came forward to share the books that they had in their shelves. That's how we started off. We scanned Kannada, Malayalam, Telugu, and we got some very interesting community collaborations. Like we got some books from the border of Pakistan and Punjab, and we got Sindhi books from there, and we were able to scan them. So we made them accessible. And meanwhile, we started working on making use of OCR technology to see if we can search within the books. That gave us a different type of power altogether. So what we tried to do with literature back in 2010 to 13 with a lot of coding and development, we could do that in few minutes by using OCR technology. So Google Vision API helped us achieve that to one level. Then we worked with Sushant and we were able to like see that, okay, it makes a lot of sense to OCR all the stuff that we have put up on Internet Archive. Then later we got Tesseract playing a big role. And today, anything and everything that we actually digitize through our scanners and make it available on Internet Archive gets OCR'd automatically. So almost 140 plus languages are OCR today using Tesseract. And you won't believe the type of responses that we have got from the community. We have digitized 50 years of Kasturi magazines from 1940s. And we are scanning the 100 years of Karmavira magazine. And we have some very interesting collections that we have created. For example, Yakshagana collection. So we got a lot of books from coastal Karnataka. And while working with Vishwakonkani Center, we scanned almost 4,500 books related to Konkani. So those are made available. And we have the largest Tulu books collection available on under Servants of Knowledge. So all these things happened because of the community collaborations and people who really wanted to preserve the literature and make it accessible to public. While working on this, the biggest challenge that we had was the copyright and the permissions and rights. So in many cases, we wanted to be very sure that we have the permissions for scanning those books. So initially we approached the authors. Our authors themselves approached us saying that I want to make my book accessible to public for free. So that is the type of responses that we started getting in very early stages of Servants of Knowledge. We have Dr. T.R. Anantramu who gave away 40-50 books related to science in Kannada, and we released them under Creative Commons license. Even before all this, in 2010, we had worked with G.T. Narayan Rao's family to release all his books under Creative Commons license. That was the very first collection of content that was made available. And when we recreated similar effort through Servants of Knowledge, we were able to scan the original first edition of those books and put them available for public. So that is what gave us the base. People understood that we need to preserve the old books. We need to make the books accessible to public, otherwise it does not make sense. Meanwhile, the families and the authors also approached publishers to give us permission to scan them. That was the other major thing that actually happened. So that helped us gain access to some of the very interesting magazines that were never seen by people who were born in 80s, 90s also. Right? So we went to Navakarnataka Publications. We were able to digitize almost 20 years of their Rosatu magazine. Today it is available. Not just the literary content, but also political content that is available online. Similarly, when we were approached by a family member of Payam Acharya, we found that he was a editor for many different newspapers and magazines. And he himself used to write in 5-6 different titles. And that gave us an access to 50 years of Kasturi magazine. If you really want to go back and see how science was communicated to the common man, right, from various different parts of the country, that is the major example. And as I mentioned, the OCR helped us go inside the book and find out what was written in which time. So it really created a time machine for our language, not just for Kannada, but also for the rest of the Indian literature that we digitize through Servants of Knowledge. Today, we build these scanners here, and we operate at the rate of 45 to 50,000 pages scans a day. Okay, so every month we are every month we are hitting 12 lakh pages. Last year we did 1 crore pages overall under Servants of Knowledge. So this wouldn't have happened if we wouldn't have discussed these matters as a community, as someone who is really interested in public domain, open access and open knowledge people. Yeah.
Thank you, Om. He has done an amazing job managing that scanning operation. So I want to close with a few comments, and then we're going to open up for question and answer. And I will put it to you that every generation has an opportunity, right? If you were in the 1950s, maybe you worked on aircrafts, or in the 20s you were working on radio. And today, I think universal access to knowledge is the great promise of our generation. And I think, as you can see, servants of knowledge, there's really three threads here. We're all pretty technical. Doesn't mean everybody has to be technical, but in order, if you want to put knowledge online, you need that technical base, because, and you needed it in the last century. If you were printing books, that was very technical, right? How to typeset, what kind of paper, what kind of ink. And so the technical skills are important. The research skills are important. What knowledge is out there? What needs to be preserved? And then you need to know the law. And that's why we work with people like Lawrence Liang to understand what's out there and what are we allowed to do. Can we scan an in-copyright book and give it to a student in the course of their education? Can we scan any book and make it available to the visually impaired? The answer to those are yes. So in addition to this range of uses available, this careful analysis of what's there, that allows us to question authority. Because often people will look at copyright and they will say, it's an absolute right. I have copyright over this material, go away. And I've written 9 books. And I've had publishers say, oh, you've got a 1-sentence quote in here from another book. Did you get permission? No, I didn't get permission. I don't need permission. I'm able to do that. And I've got over 6,000 videos of the United States government in the FedFlix collection. Those are public domain, because in the US, works of the United States government have no copyright. I'm constantly getting queries from video producers saying, I love that video, will you give me a license? I say, no, I won't give you a license. It's public domain. Go ahead and use it. And so you need to know that. So one of the things we do is we know the law, and we're working with places like the National Law School with copyrighted materials. But a lot of what we do is we go look for public domain material that's out there. So US federal government, work that's prior to 1927, work that's out of copyright, work that is absolutely vital. And we can find the copyright owner and say, you're not using this. Other people might be interested. Many people don't write books to make money. They might think they're going to make money. Most authors don't. But most authors want fame and glory. They want their words out there for other people to hear. So Lawrence accused me of being a Gandhian, guilty. And Gandhi told us that we're never property owners, we're trustees. And he taught us that we must do bread labor every day. And for him, that was spinning. And actually, I don't know if you know this, but bread labor in the original days, in the ashrams in South Africa, everybody at the ashrams there had to print every day. They had a printing press. Gandhi was the consummate blogger in the early days. He was constantly bringing in information from other places, typesetting it, putting it back out. That's how we won the fight in South Africa, by disseminating knowledge. But then the other thing he did as he moved into India is he began spinning, because he felt it was really important that India gain control. And that's because the great cotton mills out there in England were taking the raw materials, processing them, and then selling them back in. And so for him, scanning was a duty. And I put it to you that today scanning is the new spinning. So I hope you have questions. There's an audience mic here. Please, please go ahead and come on up. If you don't ask questions, we'll ask you questions. But please, it's an open discussion at this point. So anybody? Yep. And go ahead and line up at the mic, because we've got time.
So yeah, I think this question will go to Larry. What are the laws around scanning personal materials of people who you don't know? For instance, diaries, or who owns that material, and how does one deal with it?
Diaries and letters are actually a very interesting example that actually illustrate the difference between tangible and intangible property. So for example, if I were to write a letter to you, or no, my letters won't be worth much. Let's assume a celebrity wrote a letter to you. Let's say Lady Diana wrote a letter to you. What can you do with the letter? Who owns the letter, right? Could you tear the letter if you didn't like the content of it? Of course you can. Could you burn the letter? Of course you can. Could you auction the letter at Sotheby's? Yes, you can, because you're the owner of the letter. Could you republish the letter? No, you can't. Right? So that's interesting here, because basically that's the difference between the tangible and the intangible. You may be the owner of the physical property or the physical copy of a book, but you are not necessarily the owner of the copyright in the book. Right? The copyright remains Lady Diana's till such time that the copyright exists. But of course, then the question that arises is, being the copyright owner, and this is what Carl said, does it mean that Lady Diana has absolute rights as a copyright owner, or are there other exceptions and limitations that actually begin to kick in, right? In the realm, for example, of what is known as exceptions and limitations, there are a whole range of possibilities. Some of them are determined by quantum, right? Let's assume I wanted to reproduce a part of the letter. How much would I be entitled to doing? The second is by intention or purpose. What is the purpose of reproducing, let's say, a part of the letter, scanning it and making it available? Or if you had to say, who are the actors involved? If I'm doing it, for example, in the context of, let's say, an educational institution or a research institution, the best story in the history of copyright is really the most bizarre story in some ways, is the battle over Kafka's legacy. Right? As we all know very well, Kafka's works were left to Max Brod, his friend, his biographer, and his documenter of everything. And the instruction that Kafka had left behind for Max Brod was, burn everything I've ever written. Now, that was a very clear instruction. As a lawyer, I can tell you, it was a valid instruction as a will. Max Brod was legally obliged to burn everything that Kafka had ever written. Thankfully, Max Brod was not the most law-abiding person. And Max Brod said that, I've known Kafka, and I've known Kafka better than anyone else has. Forget, the trial and America and Castle. If Kafka ordered something in a restaurant, I wrote it down, because I recognized the genius in this man. And I also knew he's a drama queen. He didn't really want me to burn the material, right? I mean, he was being, so I know better than you that Kafka didn't really intend this. So what does Max Brod do? Max Brod takes everything that Kafka has ever written, boards the last train to leave Prague before Prague is taken over by the Nazis. If he had not boarded that train, it was in all likelihood, just like Kafka's sisters died, in the concentration camps, that Max Brod would have died, and along with it would have been Kafka. Max Brod goes, of course, goes to Israel, becomes a Zionist, and gets into a relationship with his secretary, Esther Hoff. And after he dies, he wills whatever is remaining of Kafka's writings to Esther Hoff. Esther Hoff passes away and then wills it to her two daughters. And then a Kafkaesque drama plays out. Because what happens is the two daughters live in a house with 24 cats and a trunk full of the unseen writings of Kafka. They offer to sell it to the German Literary Archive. The German Literary Archive claims to be the legitimate heir of Kafka's writings because they have all of Kafka's writings, and after all, Kafka wrote in German. This is objected to by Israel, saying that no, Kafka is Israeli property. After all, he was Jewish. The two women say that, well, this is private property because we are the owners of all of this material, right? The only people who didn't really take part in this, unfortunately, was Czechoslovakia. You say that he was from Prague, but they didn't have the money to participate in this long lawsuit. But this lawsuit went on for a long time, and the question was, who is the rightful owner of Kafka? So there is a complicated kind of set of questions involved in the question of what do you do with memory, right? What do you do with diaries, letters, anonymous? And I think that it's both as much an ethical question as it is a legal question. There are questions of privacy. There are questions, in a way, of propriety, not merely questions of property that are involved over here. Let's assume we take care of this. Then the property question actually gets a little more diminished to my mind. The problem is when articulated only as a property question, which is what copyright unfortunately does. And I think that a larger perspective on this, which brings all of this together, would make it in a way a question worthy of, let's say, a Kafkaesque, rumination, rather than some boring bureaucratic legal approach to it.
Let me add one point on that one. Copyright expires on everything, right? It's not forever. It's not infinite. It may seem infinite with the current copyright laws. So if you've got a diary, you can scan it. You may not be able to post it, but you should scan it and preserve it. And then you've got that, and you are a trustee of that knowledge. And at some point, you'll be able to make it public. But if you've got those diaries of someone else, you should preserve them. And the physical copy might get burned, it might go away. So you have a duty to scan that and keep it forever.
What is the time limit?
In India, it's 60 years after the death of the author.
Right.
There is no standard time limit across the world. In the US, for example, it's a different time. And part of the reason there's only one real kind of reason for why the timeline of copyright has constantly got extended, and that's Mickey Mouse. So it's every time Mickey Mouse's copyright has expired, the US has extended it.
We have two more questions lined up here.
So my question is for Carl. I think the Internet Archive was successfully sued recently about their National Emergency Library. And I saw a lot of hand-wringing at that time about the future of the Internet Archive itself. But my question is a bigger one about how you're thinking about long-term digital preservation and access.
So the Internet Archive was sued for their controlled digital lending, and it's based on the idea that I've got a physical copy, I scanned it, I put the physical copy on a shelf, I loan the digital copy. That's called the own-to-loan ratio, right? If I've got one copy, I can loan one copy at a time. Then they would loan an encrypted version to you for a limited period of time, and then it would expire. You check it back in, and then the next person would borrow it. And when COVID hit, Brewster Kahle, who founded the Internet Archive, felt very strongly that education is a right, and libraries all over the world were closed. And he removed the own-to-loan ratio, and he called that the National Emergency Library. So he had one copy, and he loaned it to as many people simultaneously as wanted to read it. Turned out it wasn't that many people, but the publishers went bananas. And they sued him, the four largest publishers, not only for the National Emergency Library, but for the concept of controlled digital lending itself. And he lost at the initial level of the district court. The judge just didn't buy it. He said, controlled digital lending, no. If publishers want to make an ebook, they'll sell an ebook, and you can't make an ebook out of the physical book. They are different things, and you are competing with their market. That's a district court decision. I must say, in my lawsuits, right, I was sued for posting the laws of Georgia. I was found guilty at the district court level. They said I was a commercial operation. We are strictly nonprofit. They said we lost on these nebulous four uses you have in the United States. We went to the Court of Appeals. We won. We went to the Supreme Court. We won. And my advice to Brewster was the higher up you go, the more a judge is willing to look at that. Now, there's two questions that you really asked there. What's the future of the Internet Archive, right? So all the books they scan can be made available to the visually impaired globally. That continues. They have many other things, millions of books, public domain, that continues. They have a TV archive, they have a radio archive, they have the Great 78 collection, right? So all of that continues. Long-term, survivability is the key, right? And I've been working on the internet for probably 40 years now. If you have one copy of something, it will go away. And we've learned that with real libraries. Library of Alexandria, gone. libraries in Germany, gone. Other libraries, it's termites, it's floods, it's fire, it's whatever. So you need multiple copies. Lots of copies keeps things safe. So if you're interested in long-term archiving, you need to propagate that data. So all our data that we scan is on the Internet Archive, but we have preservation copies. We have multiple preservation copies, even if the great earthquake hits the Bay Area. Even if things like that happen, our data will survive. And again, that's one of your technical responsibilities as a librarian, as a trustee, to preserve that material.
I just wanted to add one dimension to this, which illustrates the difference between the US, copyright standards and Indian copyright law. One of the grounds in the Hatchet case, which is the Internet Archive case, was the question of, can you digitize at all? And this is grounded on two judgments, which is the Google Book case and the Hathi, Trust case. And what was the requirement in both of these cases in terms of a standard that had been established was that there was a necessity of what is known as transformative authorship. That you were doing something that radically changed. So the argument in Google, for example, is snippet view search is a transformative authorship. And in the case of the Hatchet, they arrived at the conclusion that there wasn't sufficient transformative authorship. In Indian copyright law, you don't even need it because there is actually an exception provided for every library to automatically have the right to digitize what they already own. So it's a different threshold question, right? And that is, a fundamental difference between the two. So, and I think that, in the long run, as Carl said, hopefully even within the US system, on appeal it will change. But in India, we actually have a lot more flexibility.
So in the US, you do it, you roll the dice, you hope you don't get sued. If you get sued, it goes to the judge, and the judge does this 4-factor analysis. In India, you can still get sued for anything, no matter what, right? But if you're doing it in the course of instruction, you've got a lot more feeling that what you're doing is okay, right? Because that's listed in the Act. There's another difference. In the United States, the Copyright Act has evolved as a statutory creature, including things like this fair use analysis. In India, the Copyright Act is deeply rooted in the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution. It is not just a Copyright Act. It is an expression of the fundamental values. And so you have a stronger leg to stand on in many cases when you're doing things. But most importantly, you have these exceptions. You say, hey, this is my research use, and I'm not sharing it, but I am making a copy for my research use. You're probably okay on that. You're not rolling the dice and waiting for a judge to do a 4-factor analysis on you. So, next question, please. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, good evening. Genealogy, diaries, religion. I'm in possession of diaries, notes, a lot of works from missionaries who converted one of my ancestors. I don't validate some of the views. Now, I would like to publish family history, okay? Very carefully, because there's a lot of controversy, because there are some members of the family all over the world, including America, who will definitely not be in agreement. So my question, they will sue, of course they will sue. So my question is, who holds the copyright? I am in physical possession of these books and diaries, but once I publish, I want to know, okay, just can you elaborate on what could happen?
Okay, a couple questions. How old are these things?
More than 60. One of the diaries is definitely more than 60 years old. It's about 80 years old, 80, 90.
Are the people alive?
No, they're not alive.
I don't know.
So it's so calculation has to be on. There isn't a single answer. It's work to work. So when you say, for example, it's 60 years after the death of the author, in which case there is no copyright. If you're the owner of the physical copy of the book, effectively, you can digitize it, put it up, etc. There's no claim that even arises. In borderline cases, for example, let's assume that it isn't 60 years since the death of someone and the material is there. You're in physical, you're the owner of the thing. There are a couple of questions that would arise. Copyright is not an automatic right, right? Copyright is a statutory right, and there are various threshold criteria defined to what qualifies for copyright protection. So, for example, an original work is a minimum qualification. Now, originality here doesn't mean, Wordsworthian originality. It just means point of origin. So, in this case, even if you've written a diary with very little original thought, it would be an original work. So, it is the subject matter of copyright. The question is, what is the scope and extent to which protection could be claimed? In your case, if you're writing, let's say, a family history, and you're not using the entire diary in terms of reproducing it necessarily, no problem at all in terms of usage, right? Because the second threshold criteria in copyright is what is known as basically the quantum. So there's something called, a quotation right. Why are you allowed to quote, for example, in journal articles or in books? Because the quantum is so small that it does not actually alter in any way the original work. Second, Section 52(1)(a)(1) of the Copyright Act has a very, 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 very important exception, which is personal use including research, followed by for the purposes of criticism and review. The words criticism and review are very, very broadly defined. They haven't really, they are the subject of various cases in India. And the courts in India have basically said that any work that is used in conversation with another work is absolutely fine. So if you're doing scholarly work, you're absolutely good to go. It's only when you're reproducing the entire work in a digital form that you would want to be a little cautious about the copyright question. Not because the dead ancestor has a problem, but the dead relative me. I mean, the living relative me.
Connected to that, can I ask about research? The research material that I would extensively want to use is, tons of pages of shall I say, literature and praise of one particular religion.
Yeah.
Religion is extremely controversial. I don't abide by that at all, but the research would have to quote that.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah, okay.
You're absolutely well within your rights to use it.
All right, great. Thanks.
Okay, good. So the next question, please. And when it comes to copyright-specific issues, it's often, a fact-based thing. So this session is not necessarily a clinic on each and every use, but we're more than happy to discuss the general principles on things. But each thing, the issue is, no matter what you do, you could always get sued. But if you're on a strong ground, right, if what you're doing you think is good, and you've thought about it, and you've done a little bit of research on copyright, you should stand your ground, right? Because you're probably okay. And in many cases, you're not going to get sued, right? So if you've got what's called an orphan work, right? It's a book from, 1930, right? Maybe it hasn't been 60 years since the death of the author. Maybe it's been 55 years. It's out of print. It's not commercially available. At least in my case, I'm probably willing to take that risk. It's a risk, though. It's a risk. So, next question, sir.
Yeah, I'll begin by thanking the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress, and all you gentlemen for helping me take the Constitution of India to a wide range of people, because that's where I found the best digital scans of the Constitution of India. Nobody else in India seemed to have good usable versions of it. So that's just one use case of this. But coming to the question, do you have two questions? One, do you foresee National Portrait Gallery versus Wikimedia kind of a thing in India with the kind of work that you're doing? Especially, say, for example, some work of Ravi Verma's or other artwork. Do you foresee that happening, that playing out here? And the second question is more to do with AI-generated material, particularly about, say, the authorship and ownership of the new content that's generated. What if the content is, if it's public domain, the AI is fed with domain from public domain, content from a public domain should be fine. But what if AI has picked up some, has been fed some copyrighted material, and then future authorship and ownership issues, don't you see that as a cause for concern?
So I get a lot of AI questions. So if you're taking somebody's copyrighted image, right, it's on a website, it's copyrighted, and you're ingesting it, and you can make a derivative work. It's a picture of Snoopy that Andy Warhol did, and you're adding other things. Now, you've made a derivative work. You've probably, the .com Silicon Valley folks, have probably violated the copyright. And there's some very significant issues there. And I can tell you in the United States, the content owners, right? Particularly the kind of IP maximalists, right? The Hollywood and they're up in arms. And that's going to battle out over time. And the AI stuff right now, it's flavor of the month. And I think some of that hype is going to die down a bit. And in terms of the portraits, I don't know. The big thing we always try to do is avoid the controversy. And so we look for things that pretty much everybody agrees ought to be available. And as a general rule, occasionally I get people getting upset about some of the stuff we've put online. We usually send them back a letter. And we don't ignore them. We don't say rude things. We send them a long, considered letter about why we did it, why it's important, the mission of their organization, and why we think it ought to be available. So the answer is I don't know. And again, it's something you just have to look at. And at the end of the day, you make your best judgment. And again, anybody can sue anybody over anything in India and in the United States. And you're just trying to do it in a way that, and particularly if the content you've picked, everybody agrees is okay. But even if it's controversial, you should know enough of the law that you kind of know where you are. But you're always rolling the dice. My stuff is always what's called an issue of first impression. It's never been done before. And so if you go to a lawyer and say, am I allowed to do that? The answer is it depends. Or the answer is don't do it because who knows? Okay. So I'd like to recognize Dr. Sushant Sinha, who is in the audience. He works very closely with us. I've worked with Sushant for a long time now. He is a key contributor to our effort. And so I just wanted to recognize him here. So do we have more questions? Please, microphone. If you have questions, please come on up to the front, and we're trying to tape this thing, so we want your questions on mic. Sir.
Yeah. So ethically, I wanted to ask, like legally, I understand where controlled digital lending is coming from, but according to all three of you, what does the future of this looks like? This 1:1 ratio, this has been currently been put up because of the lending system. So what ethically, where do you think this looks like 10 years, 20 years down the line, if you feel there can be like more people requiring more copies, but they are bound by the 14-day window. So
yeah, look, controlled digital lending is not dead. There was a district lower court opinion in the United States. The EU Court of Justice many years ago issued an advisory opinion to the Netherlands saying it's allowed. Yeah. Right? We're pretty sure controlled digital lending to a student in the course of their education in India is allowed. It's new. Anything new, people are going to complain about. But the question is, are you on solid ground? I think 10 years from now, look, print books are getting destroyed. They're going away. I know in the future, a lot of content, you won't be able to own it. You're going to have to lease the ebook. Yes. But we're pretty sure that whole back file there needs to be copied. It needs to be digitized. Yeah. And we're pretty sure we're going to be able to loan it to you. Or eventually, like I said, all copyright expires. Right? So if nothing else, you scan it now and at some point it becomes available. And so what will the future be? I don't know. But one of the ways we can change the future is to continue scanning and putting information online and being a balance to the people that are, I own all knowledge, right? And we have some big publishers that are in that camp. Yeah. And we have to stand up.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was pointing towards, that this 1:1 ratio of a physical book to a digital copy. Like, we've reached so far from what I've heard, we've had mechanisms in place. So why can't it be a 1:10? Why can't it be a 1:20 people? So that's where...
it's because Michelle Wu at Georgetown came up with the own-to-loan ratio. She was the librarian there. And that sounds good to us, and it sounds safe. It's easy to explain to people. And so that's what we're doing today. So the question in the course of education in India, does it have to be an own-to-loan ratio? I don't know. But it's pretty safe if you start there, we think. We think. But again, maybe some people won't think that way. But we're pretty sure that's okay.
So I just want to comment on this. if 10 years ago you'd asked the question of whether in the course of instruction I could photocopy an entire book and give it to my student, or am I bound by, let's say, a number of chapters, as, for example, is the course PACS scenario in the US. Our answer would probably have been that, oh no, I don't think any court is going to allow you the reproduction of an entire book. But then you can have the Delhi University photocopy case where the court said, we don't want to go into a discussion of quantitative restrictions because you can't draw a fine line. At what point of time can you argue that, well, only chapter 1 was needed for this particular class and not chapter 2? Instead, we're only going to go into a fact-to-fact spaces on which you say, what was the purpose? If the purpose was education, the Copyright Act does not lay down any quantitative restriction. Now, on own to loan, there's similar, incrementally, one would have to say that let's begin with the assumption of own to loan. Let's assume that you have a consortium of libraries, in which case the number of copies you own can also exponentially grow. Right? So if you have a consortium of libraries and you say that we have 50 copies of Granville Austin's Working a Democratic Constitution, has that changed? Does the fact of a consortium make a difference? These are all open-ended questions at the moment. We will both err on the side of caution, but not allow ourselves to be subsumed by the presumption of what the law might be.
Yeah. And sometimes laws are wrong, right? I mean, there was a law saying you're not allowed to make salt, right? Well, people made salt. And that law went away. Do we have any more questions? Please come up to the microphone if you have questions. And we need more questions for Om Shiva Prakash. Please come up to the microphone if you have questions. Yeah.
So it's a bit like my earlier question, but what about works where you don't know who the author is? You find stuff, but find stuff that's,
I don't know, how old's the work?
I mean, it could be from the 40s, 50s, it's tough to know. And if it's ethically, again, borderline, but it's important for research.
Is it a printed book or is it a handwritten thing?
It's a painting, hand-drawn paintings and pornography, actually.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, so pornography is very interesting in Indian law because pornography doesn't really have a status. Because one of the problems was that it was argued that if you gave copyright protection to pornography, you would be promoting pornography. So for a very long time, pornography didn't have copyright. And so it remains in that kind of border zone. But, on the question of anonymous works, just like in all the poetry books that we studied in school, where the greatest contributor was Anon, Anon is an acknowledged author under the Copyright Act. And has rights, etc. But again, as Carl said, more often than not a practical question. And with copyright, the rule is very simple. Just appear, don't ask. And particularly don't ask a lawyer because they'll tell you you can't do it. So do it, and then if you need to, talk to the lawyer.
Yeah, but do it carefully. I mean, so, for example, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I can probably take more risks than you should be taking if you have something. So you should be a bit conservative, but you keep doing it. And again, you look at the nature of the material and what are you going to do with it. And at the end of the day, you roll the dice, and you try to do it in a way that is relatively safe. So next question, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks Carl, Lawrence and Shivu. My question was for Shivu. There's a lot of old magazines that you've scanned and there's a lot of different language texts, right? One question was, other than people approaching you to say, can you scan this? How do you decide what you're scanning? And two, do you know who has been accessing these scanned texts? Like, for example, some of the old Kannada magazines that you've been scanning and, the Vachanas, of course, I think widely it's been accessed. But the other text, do you know who's accessing it and why they're accessing it? And these are the two questions.
Okay. Technically, we are not tracking who is accessing it because we want everybody to use it. So, yeah.
But in case, if you heard back from people,
yes. Yeah. For that, we have a lot of stories, a lot of social share that actually happens, a lot of message that we actually get from word of mouth. It comes back to us, right? People say that, yes, I did found this particular article on servants of knowledge. Then they actually start talking what we digitize, what we scan. Then they realize that the book that they found was scanned by us. Okay, and when we actually when we take up any work, first we will see if at all it is there in public domain or not. That is the first criteria. Otherwise, if it is published by a specific publisher, we try to approach them. So that's how the Lok Shikshana Trust Hubli's work were digitized completely, because Pavam Acharya used to be an editor for that for decades, and his family reached out to them, not even us. They learned what we were doing. They realized the value of the digitization and the need for the archival of the works. Then they wanted us to, they came up with a diary which had all his writings with the paper cuttings and so many other things. We said, why should we actually do this? Why don't we do the complete book itself or complete magazine itself? Then they said, okay, we can try doing that, because he was there for decades and they all understand his contribution to the land and literature. And all that we told the Lok Shikshana Trust is that anything and everything that we digitize will be made available for public. Are you okay with that? Are you okay to give access to the content? Are you okay to share the volumes that you have in your library, which is getting destroyed, right? So we had books sent from Hubli, which were printed in 1940s, 1920s, right? And we were not able to handle some of them, but still we took efforts, we put efforts to digitize them. And when they started seeing that, they found that they're not just seeing the old copies in a digital format, but they are also able to do further research for their continued publication. So Kasturi found 50-year-old Nagesh Heggde's article and they celebrated that. They said, you had written your first article on the Kasturi magazine, and we found it today. And that happened because we actually enabled them with technology. And when they keep hearing in these stories from different authors and general public, and those people have been going back to those publishers. They're not coming to us. They don't really know who actually scans these books and puts up even today. So that's why we said this is our first general public meeting for servants of knowledge. We have been digitizing from last 4 or 5 years, and we did a lot of different type of projects. To give you a number about Kannada literature digitization that we have done more than like 70 plus projects with different publishers, authors, individual families, and all the content has been made available for public under Creative Commons license, or at least with certain conditions saying that, okay, this can be used for non-commercial purpose. So that's how the content has been made available.
If you look at our overall collections on the Internet Archive, we're well over 20 crore views. If you look at the top 100 books on the Internet Archive, 30 of them come out of our collections, a tremendous number of users from India. So Internet Archive does not log, who reads what, but they log the aggregate where the regions are. And it's clear that there's a huge amount of use from India on those collections. So.
Yeah.
We have another question? Please finish.
I just wanted to add one more thing. So those numbers are also very, very interesting. So as I said, we were able to approach authors and publishers to release their works in Creative Commons license, right? They started observing that people are reading those books. And publisher also seeing that those things are being accessed by people. Now some of the books are being reprinted because people want the physical version of those books. The publisher is also there, the author is also there. Now they are actually going back to the publisher and asking for a printed copy. Can I get a printed copy? And at the same time, that also enabled us to rethink how we can actually go back and bring in some very old Kannada books. It has enabled us to recreate some old Kannada fonts. We are building revival Kannada fonts to enable OCR to identify old Kannada text, not just the ones which were actually printed from the computer era, but also from the lithographs and other things. So that has enabled us to do that. Yes.
Ma'am.
So I have two questions. One, I'm afraid, is slightly AI related, but is around provenance, right? And so the idea of provenance has gotten increasingly diluted through the idea of transformative works and derivative works. And so now that we are at the AI moment where, AI is the machine that is reading, so the reader is the machine, then what happens to the idea of provenance, right? Because when there's a source that I can recognize, that's all very well and good, and then copyright is a lot more kind of about a moral right. But when there are large corporations who might say, oh, this is educational use, then what happens to the idea of provenance? And the second question I have is for Shivu, so maybe we can address that. And I can...
Well, so when AI says this is true, one of the things we provide is you can go to the Internet Archive or Google and look at our website and go look at that source material and figure out whether that's true or not. So when somebody says Gandhi said this, I've got the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. You can go search. In fact, be the change you wish to see. Gandhi didn't say that.
Yeah.
Go search for that in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. That was a biography about him that said that. So we are a counterpoint to these, generative AI engines that are, making stuff up. That's why the source materials need to be available online. So
they do, but the problem is that people, A, don't know that's the source material, and B, they're not going to bother, right? So there's a question of, say, watermarking, right? Like, how do we ensure that we know that a text that's traveling and being ingested by the machine comes from where it comes from? And
we teach people that they should do more than simply believe Bing. They should check when somebody says this is true. Go find that source document. Not everybody will do that. That's one reason we put court cases and laws and things online. So when you see a quote, you can go find it. And who are you going to believe? You're going to believe an authoritative, authentic source, and we just want to put those tools up. And again, not everybody's going to do that, but you can't stop stupid people from doing stupid things, but you can teach people how to do things better and hope that over time they will do the right thing. And particularly reporters and others, you can teach them where the fundamental research materials are available without having to fly to the Library of Congress, without having to go to Delhi and get permission to enter the Central Secretariat Library. So we think we're helping solve that problem. So, second question.
For Shivu. So obviously large language models in Indian languages are fairly limited. And I was just wondering whether you know about whether your work is being used for large language model corpuses and whether people are actually kind of making a distinction between the age of the texts that you're digitizing in the corpus. Thanks.
I haven't seen people using it to that extent, but they're still learning how to use the material that we have digitized. And the OCR content and text search, that itself is pretty new to our people. So we show them how to actually access that content, and we also keep telling them and reminding why we need the OCR text or the plain text format. To go back a bit, so we wanted to build corpus which can be used for creating Kannada spell checker. We didn't have that. Even today, we don't have a very good Kannada spell checker. We don't have a grammar checker. What we needed was a set of root words which can be fed into the tool, and we can use it as a base for the spell checker, right? So we are now trying to teach students and developers who is actually willing to come forward and work on building such tools to use the corpus that we have built with the help of public domain content and take it back as a wonderful contribution to open source projects. Yeah.
And I really want to emphasize that the counter to generative AI and misinformation is having the source materials online. And so what we are doing is we're not going to solve the problem of misinformation, particularly in election cycles. We're not going to solve the problem of generative AI engines making up, facts and people believing those. But we are going to provide the tools that allow people to double check and to do the original research. And that's something that students and journalists and researchers and lawyers and teachers and others can use those resources. So we're not going to solve the problem of disinformation, but we are a strong counter to that. Sir.
Hi. So I have two questions. One is, most of the audience that I've been working with have been heavily relying on web archives, the Internet Archive. And in many cases, maybe because of some information or some random geo that gets passed, Internet Archive gets shut down randomly, and then it comes back up again randomly, right? And then there is also this larger audience that we work with where there is no idea of internet access, right? So what I'm looking for is, as someone who's interested in how do I mirror Internet Archive, right? One, has people done it before, or is there an internet discussion, etc.? That's question number one. Question number two is specifically to Shiv again, is I'm more also interested in the question of going beyond what knowledge, where is the knowledge coming from, to a question also of whose knowledge are we really archiving. For example, if you take Karnataka, there is also a language called Bari that I can think of, which does not have a script. It's majorly a spoken language, but then there is a ton of knowledge that is inherent to it. If I go to Tamil Nadu, I can think of the Irulas, the Kurvas languages, almost Tamil, but not Tamil. But again, no scripts. Most of the words don't exist in Tamil, but they do tend to speak, right? So what about knowledges that are orally transmitted, right? So what of an archive of those?
So there is, I'll say a few words and then turn it over to Om. There is a beautiful endangered languages program that Arcadia funds, and there are a number of attempts to preserve orally transmitted languages, and I think that's important. As to the periodic unavailability of the Internet Archive, I believe there should be a major set of distributed services in India, right? And it shouldn't be one place. It should be distributed in many places, and that's how you make that information continue to be available. And that's something we're trying to do. We have a very large server in Bangalore. We are systematically downloading our information onto that server, learning how to serve it up. So you'll be able to go to the Internet Archive, but you'll be able to go to our servers and pull that up. That's a long-term effort. It's not easy to run these kinds of things, but we're learning how to be a library. We're learning how to do card catalogs. We're learning how to serve up images. We're thinking about the legal implications of that. And we think more people ought to be doing that kind of work, but it needs to be a distributed solution. This isn't, hello, I'm going to solve the problem. You know, big government program is going to do a National Digital Library of India. That's a, you know, well-meaning effort, by the way, and I wish them all the success they have. But you need different flavors of these things up and running. And so to me, many different places ought to be taking, particularly the public domain materials, preserving them, serving them up in different ways. You know, maybe one place specializes in a certain language, but it requires a sustained long-term bottom-up effort to do that. Om, did you have anything to add?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it is possible to, as you know, you can download the books from Internet Archive. Yes, definitely you can mirror it. There are tools available and a lot of things are possible. But as Carl very clearly mentioned, the legal implications and the need for the resources and the engineering that you need, the effort that goes into maintenance, it's beyond just one person's activity, right? It requires a consolidated effort of multiple people. And you are actually asking about oral knowledge and its digitization. So there have been a lot of local efforts which has been working on documenting that. We did that through Sanchi. So we try to digitize a lot of audiovisual documentation and make it available for public under Creative Commons license. But under Servants of Knowledge, we are not taking up that activity. But there is a very interesting stuff that you all might have seen, or many of you might know. Linguistic Survey of India has done an excellent job of documenting most of the literature that we are actually talking about. You have Barry, you have a book on Barry, and Kannada itself has a lot of dialects. All the dialects of Kannada has been very well documented by Linguistic Survey of India, and I have been trying to reach out to the publishers to see if they can release it under public domain or at least under Creative Commons license. So a collective effort from a community like this and interaction with such publishers or universities which did that wonderful work to release the content to public domain could bring them online. Yeah.
Last question, sir. You have the honor.
I'm lucky. I look at a very large archive of a community health library, and the question that keeps coming to me is, after scanning, then what? And I think you were starting to answer some of that with the last question. But apart from searching through the full text and finding content, are there other ways of curating content so that it becomes more accessible, especially when talking about knowledge repository and not just an archive?
Well, metadata is particularly important. I mean, you can scan, but what's the title? What's the creator? What's the keywords? What's the description? What's the backstory about this? So, you've scanned it, but that's just the first step. You want to curate your collection. You want to describe the items. You want to say, gee, if you like this item, go look over there, right? And we're not doing that on much of our stuff. To some we are, but as a general rule, we're scanning and we're posting, and we rely on other people to begin building on top of that. And again, with the Internet Archive, if you're even moderately technical, there's a command line tool. You can say IA download collection Hind Swaraj, and the whole thing comes on down, right? And then you can begin working with it. What you might be doing is translating works into other languages. You might be taking video and making sure the closed captions are correct or translated into other languages. But you need that core knowledge to start with. And what we're trying to do is getting that core scanning done, but encouraging a community of people, to do other things, right? It's like, gee, this should be done. Well, do it. And we'll work with you and try to teach you the tools or support you. But, people say, what can I do? And it's like, pick something that other people aren't doing and make that your passion. Right? Maybe you're into new mystics, coin collecting. Maybe there's not enough of that online. Well, make it your mission to go to the old bookstores, look for, books about coins, buy them, scan them, put them online, label them properly. And I think if we all do that, right, if we don't depend on the large corporate publishers to solve our information needs, don't depend on the major media, right? If we make our own history, if we work with those materials, that is going to be the true public library of India. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. We really appreciate it. We're going to be here again. And thank you to the Bangalore International Center. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.